Welcome to one of the preview events for the Raisina dialogue. It's very exciting to see so many people in this room, so much enthusiasm for a topic that not a lot of people know all that much about, but we will learn a lot more about today. My name is Dhruva Jaishankar. I'm Executive Director of ORF America based in Washington. For those of you who may not know, ORF America was set up 4 years ago now in Washington, and we're an affiliate of the Observer Research Foundation. We are here to talk about the very timely issue of UN reform, United Nations reform. And we really couldn't have a better panel in some ways to discuss this, and you will find out soon why if you don't already know. We are at a time when there are troubles around the world, to put it very mildly. We have obviously crises in Europe, conflict raging there, in the Middle East, tensions in the Indo-Pacific, in Africa, and not to mention political crises and civil conflicts around the world, as well as some existential issues from climate change to threats to cybersecurity to the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. And one institution that is at the same time central to all of this, but some would argue not always as effective as it should be in addressing some of these problems, is the United Nations. Yet the UN remains important. It is just by virtue of its extensive membership, it has a legitimacy that few other institutions, international institutions, multilateral institutions have. There's a growing consensus, there is perhaps a consensus, that the governance structures of the United Nations could do with an upgrade, that they reflect the balance of power of the immediate post-World War II world, where there was, and there remain 5 veto-wielding permanent members. But now, after many years, if not decades, of lip service to UN reform, we now see some signs of concrete movement. With us today, and I'll introduce our speakers right now, are 2 co-chairs of the governmental negotiations, and we'll learn a little bit more about what the intergovernmental negotiations are. And we also see at this time multiple blocks, multiple groups of countries outlining proposals for reform. Later this year, on September 22nd and 23rd, there will be a summit of the future. And one of the issues we will discuss now is whether we will have, that will be this year, will prove an opportunity to move forward in very concrete terms on something that has been lagging for many years. So first, let me turn to our 2 chairs of the intergovernmental negotiations and welcome them to New Delhi and to Raisina. We have the permanent representatives of Austria, of Kuwait, and of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, as well as Eenam Gambhir, who is Joint Secretary at the Ministry of External Affairs dealing with UN issues. Let me start with Axel Marschik, who's from Austria. Maybe you could start us off by explaining to our audience what the intergovernmental negotiations are, which you in Austria are the co-chair. What are some of the negotiations underway, and why should people take an interest now?
Thank you very much, Dhruva, and maybe let me also start out by thanking you and through you, ORF, for inviting us here and also for putting the United Nations here into the spotlight of this dialogue. And you mentioned it. The UN has been receiving some criticism, especially lately. Not only lately, I think it's a tradition that we always also voice our unhappiness with the UN, like we voice our unhappiness with most organizations that exist. And I think that's very normal. But as you said, the UN does remain the one only global organization that deals with peace and security. And since we don't have alternatives right now, I think it's important and good that we focus on trying to do better and to reform. The IGN, you asked me, what is the IGN? For UN specialists, they know it's something that you try to avoid when you're on your posting in New York, because it's something that has been going on for quite a while. Efforts for Security Council reform go back well, basically to the years right after the founding of the organization. And the first reform that we ever had was in 1963. It was a charter amendment when the Security Council was enlarged from 11 members to the current 15. So there already you can see that right from the outset, when the membership of the Security Council expanded, there was also this interest in expanding the organs of the council. But after 1963, membership continued to expand, but the organs didn't change. And that was not because there was no interest in that, but because slowly but surely it became more and more difficult to agree on, if there is a change, just how that change should look like. And I'm just going to cut this short. There have been efforts going on for a long time. And in 2000, there was an open-ended working group that met for a lot of times. In 2005, 2 resolutions were actually put on the table, and it looked like there was going to be a showdown between 2 distinct types of reform. But then they were taken back, and it was agreed that we would move into a IGN, into this intergovernmental negotiation format. And so from 2009 until today, we are running in a session which is an informal type of meeting in the GA, and we've had a lot of very repetitive years of member states stating the same positions over and over. And in the past 2 years, there has been a slight movement, and that is why there is now gaining interest. We've had some progress. We've had, for the first time, been able to actually webcast some of those meetings. There are always two-day meetings, more or less every month. The first is webcast, so you can follow it also if you are interested. And then we've also had a repository. And for the first time, it was possible to actually leave something for posterity in writing on a website that everyone can access. So while in the past you always had to come again and reintroduce your proposals, now you can point out that you've actually done that in the past. So we have some written texts which are now floating around on the repository. And as of this year, we have also started with models discussing specific ways how the council could be reformed on the basis also of texts. So there we have, for the first time, some real movement forward. Why is this? It's because I think of 2 things. First of all, we have the Summit of the Future coming up, and I think it's very clear that we will not be able to have a Summit of the Future of the UN in September of this year without something on Security Council reform. And the second reason, and I will end with that, why are we moving forward, is that we have, over the past couple of years, become increasingly frustrated with the Security Council. That has to do not so much with the fact that it is incapable of acting, because it is acting. I think contrary to 1959, for example, where the Security Council only had 5 meetings and only adopted 1 resolution. The past 2 years, where we have had these conflicts and this crisis, we've actually had over 400 meetings. We had 414 meetings in 2023. We had 419 meetings in 2022. So the council has been active. We had 50 resolutions last year and 54 the year before. So the council has not been missing, but the problem is the council has been focusing on administrating international relations instead of finding solution for those conflicts which hurt and where people expect the UN to act. So the Summit of the Future and the frustration with the work of the Council has increased the pressure, and people are expecting at the UN, but also outside, I think, that something has to happen.
Thank you. Thank you for that very nice overview. I'd like to turn to your co-chair, Tareq Albanai, permanent representative of Kuwait to the United Nations. Could you explain what some of the models being discussed are and how they differ from each other?
Sure. It's a pleasure to be with everyone here, and thank you very much for this opportunity. We are tasked by a General Assembly decision to discuss 5 clusters of issues within the reform process of the Security Council. And it's the categories of membership. It is the question of the veto. It is the relationship between the General Assembly and the Security Council. And it's the size of an enlargement and the working methods of the Security Council. Now, all these different groupings in the United Nations have different ideas of how the council would look like, a reformed council would look like. Some call for the expansion in a permanent membership, and some do not want further expansion of permanent membership. Some call for permanent membership without a veto, sort of a second-class membership of permanency in the council, and others, of course, are opposed to that. And some others who find that the question of the veto is really the fundamental problem with the Security Council. So you have different groups, of which India, of course, is a member of G4 and L69. And then you have the UFC. And like my co-chair has...
Sorry, could you just briefly explain what the UFC is? We'll hear about the other two in a bit. Some people have think of UFC meaning something else. So that's
well, it doesn't involve wrestling, but the UFC are United for Consensus. They are a group of countries, mostly middle powers in size and economies and whatnot, who are adamantly against the expansion of permanent membership or extra veto powers, because they believe fundamentally that that is the issue. The permanency, in their opinion, does not reflect a democratic process. The self-appointed benefits for the P5 have been, we all agreed to, yes, as soon as we agreed to be members of the United Nations. However, we agreed to it over the years, and it's the Council, in their opinion and in most countries' opinion, does not reflect the realities of today. And the idea with the model discussion, which is an innovation also this year, was to somehow, instead of going through the clusters, which was the traditional way of handling this and discussing each cluster alone, we would allow an opportunity for member states to put forth their vision of the new council, the reformed council, and allow them to present it to member states. And member states would have the opportunity to pick through them and indicate where there are shortcomings and indicate what is positive and what's not. And we've already seen a benefit to this process this year, whereby somebody proposed an idea of a review mechanism in their vision of a reformed council, and another member of another group decided that that is a good idea and wanted to incorporate it in their model. And the idea with these model discussions is to allow the opportunity for member states to actually revise their thinking, because this process, as my distinguished colleague indicated, has been going on for quite a long time. And yes, the council still functions, but the council still functions on the regular renewals of mandates and issues that are not controversial. But when it comes to issues of controversy, the council is rendered ineffective right now. And most people believe that it is because of the veto. So we're hoping that this discussion this year allows us to have countries and groupings come back with a revised version of their thinking, and allows the co-chairs, because we are just stewards of this process. We try to find where possible compromise and synergies are, and try to find a path where countries can come together and agree on something. Because at the end of the day, it requires the widest possible political acceptance by members for this process to move forward. And the framers of the UN Charter were very smart. The process of amending the Charter is quite complicated, and it requires a 2/3 majority in the General Assembly to adopt a resolution, and the same 2/3 majority to ratify them in their parliamentary processes, including the permanent members of the Security Council. So it sort of puts speed bumps onto that process as well. It's not impossible, but it makes it a little more difficult.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. If we can turn to Inga Rhonda King, who is the permanent representative of St. Vincent and the Grenadines to the United Nations. I believe St. Vincent and the Grenadines is the smallest country to be on the UN Security Council ever, and has been a leader in the L69. So perhaps tell us a little bit what the L69 is and what are some of the proposals that you have been advancing in that capacity.
Now, I am a member of the L69 group, which was founded in 2007. It predates the IGN. And we were founded, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines is a founding member. And we were created to advocate for an end to the interminable open-ended working group by tabling a resolution with the document number L69. And we were asking for the President of the General Assembly to begin intergovernmental negotiations. And as Axel already said, in 2009, that process began. So 2009 till now, we need another resolution already. So L69, at that time, the resolution had 25 countries on that L document. So we became the founding members. We increased to about 42, but again, because of the prolonged process, we have fallen to about 29. But I like to think that we are like a microcosm of the global South. We are India, we are Brazil, we are Nicaragua, we are St. Vincent and the Grenadines, one of the smallest countries in the UN, Nauru, Vanuatu. So we are all developing countries. We are Nigeria, we are South Africa. But so we like to think of ourselves as a microcosm of the global South. And in that, we are diverse, and we are not disinterested in sitting on an expanded permanent category, but many of us are not aspirants per se. So we support, you heard Tareq give you what the models are. We support expansion in both categories. And we are saying that we would prefer the abolition of the veto, but as long as it exists, we believe it should be extended to the new permanent categories. And why do we think so? We think that we are like the decolonizers of that institution. We believe that you cannot keep the relic of an imperialist past intact. So if we can't do away with the permanent category, and we are told we cannot because the veto rests in it, then we must decolonize it. We must ensure that it is representative of the world. So if you get a picture of what the world looks like today, we have 8.1 billion people on the planet, and 2.1 billion occupy 7 of the 15 seats, 80% of the veto power. So you see, this is what we need to decolonize. This is what and we know representativeness is not the only criterion, but it is a critical criterion. And perhaps in the back and forth, I will tell you why we know representativeness is a critical component in shaping how discussions take place and perspectives are brought to bear on decision making. So our model, expansion in both categories, we see we owe the veto, the UN owes its creation to the veto. So today, we believe Well, the UN was created to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. So what would be the defining notion of why we are reforming it? We are reforming it because then you had 51 countries, now you have 193. Many were colonies at the time. But today, we are arguing, in the South, the Africans, for one thing, are arguing on the point of historical injustices. And that is a critical component, historical injustices. Now, the historical injustice. So what do we mean by that? I would refer to a book. I see the USG might well be familiar with Walter Rodney's book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. And in that book, Walter Rodney proposed that there is need for us to look at what Europe looked like before it went to Africa, what it looks like since it went to Africa, what Africa looked like before the Europeans visited Africa, etc. You get the picture. So we can't always be told, go govern yourself better. We need to look at the picture, hence the need for expansion in both categories. If we cannot get rid of the permanent category, we need to bring it into the 21st century. It must be reflective and in response to SDG 16 and, more importantly, Target 16.8 that expressly asked that institutions include the developing countries. And we compliment India. We are in India today, very, very pleased that under the leadership of Prime Minister Modi, we now have the African Union in the G20. That is a response to 16.8. And similarly, that is what we want for Security Council reform, for it to be reflective. And hence, we reject the UFC model because it keeps the imperialist structure intact. Reform will not be complete until and unless you get rid of that and you decolonize it. So back to you. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. If I can turn to Joint Secretary Eenam Gambhir, could you give, we've heard a little bit about some of the models and the processes that are underway, and as well as the L69 that India's part of. Could you give a little bit more detail about explaining India's views on UN reform, particularly to those who may not be following it in close detail, including India's role in the G4 as well?
Thank you very much, Dhruva, and thank you to my fellow panelists for such rich remarks. I will build on some of the points made by them, especially PR of St. Vincent and Grenadines, who's a member of L69, which India is also a member of. So I think it's important to note that for any person following these discussions from the outside, a lot of times the discussions are very focused or seen from the prism of two major issues, which is the division on the categories of membership, whether expansion should be happening or not in the permanent category, and the veto. But I think if we look at countries who have recently served in the council or over the years, or even those who are observing the workings of the councils in the last couple of years or even decades, it'll be very clear to us that the dysfunction, and when we're talking about reform, I think it's important to note that we're wanting to reform it so that we make it more effective, right? More efficient, more effective, so that it can actually resolve the issues that are in front of us more effectively. Now, you look at the council and you look at the composition and you see how it's working, and it's very clear the council is stuck in a binary dynamic. Now, that binary dynamic is because of the composition of the council. And yes, the E10, the elected members have been making a lot of efforts in creating a little dent in that. But I think all of us who have served in the non-permanent category also know that it's a daunting task from the outset, given the power structure of the council and the way it is structured. So that's one thing, right? Like the council is stuck in a binary dynamic. It approaches the issues, the decisions that it takes, the proposals that comes to it, the way countries take up penholdership from that binary perspective.
If I can just ask on just to give an example to people of the binary dynamic.
Yes.
Say the Ukraine, the resolution.
I will go
on
there.
Ukraine.
Yes.
Yeah. What is an example of a non-binary?
Yeah, I will go there. So I think, now this is the council, but you look at the world, you look outside, you look at the issues that the council, the same issues that we are discussing in the council when they're discussed outside. It's very clear the world is not binary or bipolar for that matter, right? And I think this is something that came very clear to us. Again, you asked for an example, and I'll speak of my recent involvement in the G20 process, where we were negotiating the G20 declaration, and we were having on our hands an issue which was, dealing with finding consensus on the Ukraine paragraph, which has had so far in the council and in other forums been, again, because of the dynamics seen from a very sort of binary perspective. And it was also in the G20. We faced that during the Indonesian presidency and large part of our presidency. But what we, and I must say here with the help of very strong leaders from the Global South, were able to do is to create space and reprioritize the dynamics of those discussions to ensure that the agenda of the G20, which was the agenda of the Global South, which was the agenda of the Indian presidency, is not in any manner sidelined, even when we discuss issues which had those dynamics. We did not create a third side, and that's where I think I want to bring in that when we talk about the reform of the council and the Indian position and what L69 chair also said, it is not necessarily sort of creating more sides. It is changing the way and creating a dent on that bipolar, binary perspective, which is a lot of times looks at things from competition rather than cooperation, and from that perspective. And I think in the G20 declaration, we were able to create consensus on something that consensus hitherto had not existed. And that was a recognition of the fact that the discussions are happening in a multipolar setting, and the agenda indeed is something that's important for the world in terms of the Global South agenda, and that cannot be sidelined. And I think for us, therefore, it is the reform in that category, in the permanent membership that we are looking for, and the only way to do it is from our perspective, what the L69 chair spoke about. Again, it's a negotiations. We're very happy to hear other ideas of reforming, not necessarily tweaking. And I think that's where we do not appreciate those models which completely sideline the issue of how are you going to reform the dynamics that plagues the permanent membership of the council today. So I think this is where this is how we approach this perspective. Thank you.
Just for clarification again for people, the G4 position is that the 4 G4 countries, that's India, Germany, Japan, and Brazil, are become permanent representatives. And then there's also a mention of other countries as well, right?
So in terms of the groupings, the G4 is the only group where countries have put themselves as the potential candidates for the permanent category. There are, of course, discussions. The African group speaks about 2 African seats. The Arab group speaks about, but there are no candidates that have been put forward. So that's what I think differentiates G4 a little bit from the other countries. But in terms of the basic position about reform, that is very similar to some of the other groupings that we just spoke.
Do you want to jump in on that?
I wanted to not so specifically, but to give another example of non-binary intervention. When we sat on the Security Council, one of our foreign policies stated clearly that while we are on the council, while St. Vincent and the Grenadines is on the council, as the sixth region of Africa, we will support African solutions to African challenges. So, second week on the council, the Mali file there was a debate on the issue of Mali, and sitting there, I realized, well, that could have been our statement. You know, it's the same thing. So I checked with my colleagues. I said, did you hear anything that we should not agree with? And there wasn't. So I aligned with it. And then, and of course, that's sent ripple effects because that's a new thing. You know, right on the floor, you're seeing that we are aligning, but it was on the basis of our foreign policy. If Africa agrees, they were dealing with the A3, it was one statement. So subsequent to that, I approached them and said, could we coordinate? Let's do this. And the A3+1 was born. What we did repeatedly was not just make joint statements, but we were now 4 seats on African issues, and Vietnam joining. We now have the second edition of that with Guyana from the Caribbean. But there is a concrete example of us building a firewall because we had a different perspective on how a situation should be dealt with. Ethiopia. So in 2020, 2021, there was a dust-up. The Tigrayan, the TDF army there was a friction between the government and the TDF. And the usual response would have been open meetings, going in, pressuring. And we said no. We needed to create a space for the African solution to take hold. And we bought time, pushed back, and they interceded, and we did have a solution and allowing space for elections that would have been a historic election. So we created that space. Had we not done that, what we would have had is the usual cycle. But so it gives the idea of how, and we had many examples. They're not big examples, but that was one of the most remarkable showing of what different perspectives can do from the South.
I just want to ask one more round of questions of the panelists before opening it up to the floor. Maybe start with Axel here and Tareq as the co-chairs, but explain a little bit what the Summit of the Future is. It has a very ambitious name. It's coming up in September. What is it, and what do you hope to achieve at the Summit of the Future?
I would love to give that to my co-chair, but the Summit of the Future is something that was mandated, that the states decided 2 years ago that in September of 24 we would get together and try to achieve a big package of reforms to make the UN fit for the next 30, 50 years. And basically that's what we're working towards now on various work strands, and there will be a pact for the future which is being currently negotiated. And there are all sorts of reform ideas in there. I think I don't want to stress the patience that we are supposed to focus here a little bit on Security Council reform, but it comprises questions of the future of peacekeeping, the future of digital, the digital compact which is being negotiated. So there are all sorts of issues where we think the UN should be active and will be active in the future. And of course, the Security Council reform should be part of that.
What do you hope to, I mean, maybe just to add on to that, where do you see the IGN also going? You know, what is the pathway forward now, looking ahead?
Well, just to expand on what Axel said. So we had requested the membership last year, as we closed the IGN session, that the task of writing the paragraph or paragraphs regarding Security Council reform in the Pact of the Future be tasked to the IGN, so that we don't have parallel conversations in the IGN and in the process of negotiations on the Pact of the Future. And kindly, the membership agreed, and this year we will be proceeding to do so. We've already had a session, an informal session, to listen to member states' views on what kind of language or reform or the breadth and of the ambition that we should have. Let's remember that the Pact of the Future, which is the document that's going to be adopted in September by our heads of state and government, is a consensus document. So the language that is in that needs to be agreed by every member state. So as you can see, with the disparate views of member states, it's not an easy task, but it will be a task. There are fundamentals that everybody agrees on, and it's basic. A council more effective, more efficient, more dynamic, representative. There are basics that we are finding that pretty much everybody agrees on. The only difference is how to go about achieving that ultimate goal. And all the ideas, honestly, on the table are worth further elaboration and worth further negotiation between the parties, because there will be pathways. I mean, the status quo cannot continue. It's as simple as that. Close to 100 heads of state and government last year in the General Assembly in September spoke in the high-level segment of the general debate to Security Council reform. And if our leaders dedicate a part of their one of the most important statements in the year to that, it means that there is momentum and there is a genuine thirst and need for this to happen. And the IGN, everybody agrees, is the actual right modem for that. And this is what we're going to try to do here.
And could if I just add one thing, Tareq and I are really going to try to put something on the table that's going to be ambitious, because we know that the negotiations usually end up watering things down. So we really want to use this opportunity. Every couple of years, this is not the first reform summit we have. Everyone who's been following the UN for many years, we had big reforms 2005. So it comes up over and over. But these opportunities can be stepping stones in reform processes, and we're going to do our best to try to push this big group of 193 as far as we can. But always bear in mind, it's not the two of us that take the decision. It is 193 who have to take the decision together. So I think what we're looking for is to take a step forward. Will not be the final reform, but it will be a big step forward. And also, don't forget, some parts of the reform require charter amendment, but also there's improvement that can be seen also in improving working methods, which does not need a charter amendment as well.
Maybe to you, how do you see the Global South's interests being supported in the coming few months and in the run-up to the Summit for the Future and the Pact for the Future?
Yeah. Well, we are hopeful. We have two excellent co-chairs. All our co-chairs tried, but they have moved the needle most recently in the 75th Declaration, asked that we instill new life, and they have. So we now have webcasting, and hopefully they will have something useful in the what you call it, the Summit of the Future. However, the Pact for the Future. However, we currently, they've heard me say already, we currently have a ceiling which we should not forget. It's the Sustainable Development Goals, and we should still be aiming for that. It asked, and I mentioned it earlier, that we have better representation in institutions from the South, and we see that as our as the mandate, so to speak, to have reformed the council by then. So hopefully the language coming here would turbo boost that, and we see that. So we are in support of something being put in there that will turbo boost 2016, our 2015 Sustainable Development Goals.
And as many people know, the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, took a bit of a beating because of COVID and a number of other developments. Final question to Eenam Gambhir. What do you see as, if I can just add on, what do you see as some of the obstacles also from India's perspective to getting some of the reforms through in the next few months?
So I think, building on to what our colleague said, and I think it's also important to note that this is a very important year, not only from the perspective of the Summit of the Future, but I think where the world finds itself, in terms of coming out of some of the unprecedented crisis and really dealing with, gathering hope to see what is it that we need to do, invest today, in terms of being ready for the future. So I think on that, when we speak of the future, and L69 and Chair spoke about and you spoke about the Global South and the stakes that are there in that. We all have been discussing about the young people and where the hubs for the growth and resilience for the future are going to be. And future and stakes are two very, very important words, which I think are important to link in this context. And if we just go to the past to then come back to where we are today. In 1945, coming out of a very, very devastating war, the composition of the council at that time was very much the keeping in mind the geopolitical balance that was needed at that time amongst certain players to prevent future wars, right? That was the idea on what the peace and security. I mean, of course, it was very intense, very, but also very specific. Today, if you look at the peace and security agenda, it is about so many things, and that is exactly what is the reflection of the world, and that's where the discussion, the stakes come in. We have seen its almost direct linkages between with food security, energy security, cyber issues, climate issues, maritime security, supply chain resilience, regional stability. So I think we really need to expand, and I think that discussion and that work is already expanding about who are the stakeholders in each of these issues. And in that context, I mean, India, the largest sort of country in terms of population in the world, Africa, also in a similar sense. How is it possible for any decision-making body to make decisions which will be effective on the ground without the young people, to whom the future belongs, being represented in that decision-making bodies? And I think our colleague from St. Vincent also spoke about how important it is to bring in the representativeness and to look for, therefore, the solutions which actually work on the ground, and how hard it is to push for it in structures which are not sort of amenable to that representation being listed. So frankly, for us, this is where really the discussion really revolves. This is where the essence of the discussion really revolves. And I think, as discussing with Ambassador King yesterday, we were thinking actually a reformed council, a more representative council, will be the pact for future. Because without representation, without the decisions being actually effective on the ground, we are risking the achievement of all our goals, because everything, as we know, as we have seen, is interlinked. So I think from that perspective, you spoke about what are the obstacles. I would say cynicism, has been one of the biggest obstacles, and we hear all sorts of synonyms of cynicism. Some people say you need to be cautious, don't rush. Some say, widest possible acceptance and all of that. And of course, and I think these are important things to be kept in mind. But at the same time, it is also important to know that we are already late, and we are already some parts of the world or large parts of the global south are paying the price for that delay. So change is inevitable. I think change will happen, and I hope and also believe that those who are real stakeholders and who have stakes in the future will ensure that that happens. Thank you.
Let me open it up for questions. I think we'll take 3 from the audience. I will start with Shashi Tharoor. Many of you will know exactly who that is, former Under Secretary General at the United Nations. And then I see a hand back there as well after that. And a third, if anyone wants to.
Forgive me, I hadn't planned to speak, but I mean, the fact is we've been discussing something that's been live for 32 years. I was at the UN when Boutros Ghali declared in 1992 that he wanted Security Council reform done and dusted by the golden jubilee of the organization in 95. And as we know, the 50th anniversary has gone by, the 60th, the 70th, the 75th, and the way things are going now, it's likely to carry on well into the centenary. And the reason is indeed, as Ambassador Albanai said, there's no question that the threshold is very high to amend the Charter. You need the 2/3 of the GA, you need all 5 permanent members on board, so you need a reform that's acceptable to a vast majority of the membership, and that's not unacceptable to the permanent members, and that's where it stalls. But as Ambassador Marschik reminded us of 1963, what happened? And this is why I'm curious about whether, other than these repetitive disagreements in the never-ending working group that became the never-ending shirking group and is now called something else, whether you are actually thinking about ways forward. In 1963, what happened? 3 of the 5 permanent members opposed expansion of the Council from 11 to 15. But the member states and the General Assembly went ahead and voted the resolution anyway. And global public opinion essentially forced the 3 recalcitrant members to finally ratify this expansion. Have you all thought at any stage of actually saying, well, let's cut to the chase, this has gone on long enough, let's have a resolution that we can put to the vote? I know one problem has been, so far you haven't got Africa on board, and Africa has 54 votes. So if you can get them on board with whatever formula, they want 2 seats and no one wants to give them 2 seats and all of this, if you can get Africa on board, you have a resolution that can get 2/3 of the General Assembly, and then you put the onus on the permanent members eventually to ratify it, but at least you have a resolution. Otherwise, 32 years of going around in circles, you'll continue doing that again.
So I think I'm conscious of the time. I'm going to call on 3 people. If you could please introduce yourself and ask 1 question each, and then we'll go down to the panel. So I think we had a lady here. Yes.
Thank you very much for the discussion. I'm Esther Krachin from the French Institute of International Relations. And my question would be on the current status and potential discussions on the upgrade of the status of regional groupings within the UN. Is there discussions ongoing on that, for instance, to reform the observer status and the related roles, or not at all? So,
I think a man back here, please.
Robbie Grammer, I'm from the United States. I was wondering if you've gotten any signals from any of the P5 members that their views might be changing on reform recently, like there might be any movement from their perspective on it. And second, I just wanted to ask about the news of the day, your perspective on the impacts of the latest veto of this resolution that failed on the Israel-Gaza conflict. What impact that has on the conflict, what impact that might have on U.S. standing and reputation in the world. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Alexandra Setenko, I'm independent political analyst from Germany, working on global peace and security. So my question is, when all the reform or creation of international institutions happened, they all happened after groundbreaking or ground-shaking events, be it League of Nations or United Nations after First World War, Second World War. So my question is, your assessment, how big is really this feeling of urgency right now to implement the reforms without waiting for another big or tragic events? So does it really there? Because I think the human psychology is like we don't want to implement a decisive changes until it's really necessary. So, and how long could this process take? How many months, years, or decades, according to your assessment?
So maybe if everyone could just pick one question to respond to, maybe we can go down. We start with Tareq.
I can't do them all.
If you can in 2 minutes. You can answer.
No, thank you. Look, I completely understand the frustration. It's obviously not up to us to put something on the table. It would have to be member states that go ahead and take that first step. The idea is that we at least get parameters set in place and then a negotiation and then going through. The fear, honestly, is that this is the process that exists and that is sustainable, albeit for such a long time, but sustainable. And the fear is if we do agree on a resolution, because we can agree on a resolution, there are some basic facts that everybody agrees to. If we pass a resolution tomorrow says Africa gets 2 seats on the Security Council permanent with all privileges, it'll pass. It'll pass and it'll go through and but it's a piecemeal approach with many oppose in the wider membership. And they want an all or nothing approach, that it's a one-time shot. So I mean, if we go through this arduous process of ratification, it will get stuck if we don't do it correctly. And we don't, because like you exactly pointed out, the P5 have to be in agreement with that. And none of the permanent members will agree to touch their permanent benefits, let's say. And the expansion in 63 happened because it didn't touch them. It's an expansion in non-permanent members, and the world was changing and the membership was much bigger. It was 113 countries at the time when that happened. So it had to happen. But now what we're talking about, let's say if we take India's model, you're talking about competitors on the same table with them with permanent benefits, a veto power and whatnot. It changes the whole dynamic of it. So I don't know how amenable they will be to something that's on the table that challenges the privileged status. Now, we won't know until we see it happen, but we have to consider that in the process. And I'm sorry, I'm just going to jump into the question on the latest American veto. This is the problem with the council. On an issue like 30,000 people have died over the last 3 months, and the council cannot take a decision on it. What kind of world do we live in when a council charged with the maintenance of international peace and security cannot make a decision on a ceasefire? This is the problem with the council.
Maybe we can go down the...
Yeah, thank you. No, I'll just, add that. Of course, our dear colleagues are leading that process. We have, colleagues who are participating. And when we are in the IGN setting, a lot of times we get to questions which sound very well in terms of an academic discussion. But I think when you hear countries who are just coming out of their tenure, the felt sense and the frustration that we have seen and heard in their views on the need for reform, because they've seen that dynamic, the very cynical dynamic play out on issues. So I think, frankly, we will not know answers to a lot of questions that, sir, you also posed until we actually do it, which is to come to a text and, say, okay, what can I give and what can I take? And what is this balance that is appearing? And I think we in the UN are experts on doing this on an annual basis. A lot of the UN processes are annual in their cycle. Summit of the Future. It didn't start 10 years ago. It's starting this year and it's finishing this year. But the IGN, on the other hand, has for some reason, been carrying on. So I think there is an opposition to, of course, the substantive aspects of the reform, and then there is an opposition to even starting the negotiations. that is where, what I said earlier about the cynicism, or for that matter, looking at what's going to happen if the reform happens and what we cannot allow to be touched and all of these things. And the interplay of that comes in. And I think, someone also spoke about what have we heard from the P5 and all of that. And I think some of these positions are public. I mean, from what we understand, 4 out of 5 are pro-reform, and they have, everyone says that, they are. But I think
if I can put you on the spot, which is the 1 out of the 5 that is not?
No, I would since all this information is in the public domain, I would let colleagues to say. But I think, or at least if we can say that 4 out of 5 have said that they are okay with expansion permanent category. Other things being discussed in more specific details. But also to say, to add to what Mr. Tharoor said, it is not really about that. It is really about the momentum and what we need, because there are things that will, if I can say, will be seen when they are seen. We cannot stop even negotiating. And I think this is what we faced when we were discussing and negotiating the G20 discussions, when we actually emerged out of those negotiations and discussed with colleagues, who are following that or anticipating what is happening, what will happen. There was so much cynicism. They're like, we didn't think you're going to come up with it, but we did. And I think it is that process that we need to go through. There is no way around it. There is no way around sitting down in a give and take scenario and negotiating. And we can, pick on things endlessly and say, will this happen? Will that happen? What will suit? Which model is the best? I will say my model is the best when I go in there, but I'm ready to negotiate. The question is everyone ready to negotiate? Thank you.
Axel?
Yes, I think Shashi Tharoor made an excellent point. Can we conjure a 1963 moment? Can we get there? Well, we are hopeful and we are working towards that, very much so. But I think we have some issues. In 1963, it was basically everyone wanted it, and not all of the P5 were there, but eventually they came under a lot of pressure and nobody wanted to look bad in preventing this, which didn't really hurt them. Have we managed to get the whole room again together and sort of put this pressure on the P5? No. At the moment, the P5 can lean back and watch the big groups within the rest of the membership fight it out and disagree. And I think we have a bit of a problem. One, we don't have such an enormous pressure yet, even though, as I think Tareq said, with the veto, with the Russian aggression against Ukraine, with the veto and the consequences to that, with the Gaza situation now, the US vetoes, I think the pressure is really rising. But is it strong enough that the P5 are worried that people are going to just dump the UN? I don't think we're right there yet. But another question is, can we get states to change and adapt their position? We have a bit of a crisis of multilateralism at the moment. We have this feeling of states coming in saying, this is my position and I want my position. And it reflects a little bit, I think, what we see socially also. If you look nowadays, I'm not sure if you have that problem. I have that problem in my family. When we try to agree on a family film on the weekend, everyone wants their own film. And everyone has their own film. They have it on their cell phone. And a lot of you are looking into your cell phones right now. You have your playlist, your news sources, your world. You are living in your world, and you are not prepared to compromise. You are sticking to what you want. You're not prepared to compromise. Multilateral diplomacy works basically on compromise. If there is no willingness to go into a negotiation and say, okay, I'm going to go back with 80% of what I want, I'm not going to get 100%, then we can get something. If you're going to go in with 100% and only prepared to leave with 100%, we have a problem. And because you mentioned the Africans, I think at the moment, many of our African colleagues seem to have the problem that they have this agreement on their position adopted by the heads of states and government. And who has the possibility to negotiate now on this, around this agreement? So I think there we are confronted with the situation that we we'll have to find a way around there, or at least together with our African colleagues, to see what we can do there in order to find a compromise. Regional groupings, one word. Yes, it's come up. It's become quite interesting. We have regions. We have the EU, for example, but we have the SIDS, small island developing states. We have Arab group also that has come up and say we want permanent representation. Of course, the problem is there are a lot of groupings out there, and what exactly that means is another question. And the P5, Robbie, yes, we've signals from all of them that they're looking towards some readiness to accept reform. But at the moment, the big problem is they lean back and watch the room play out.
So one of my takeaways is we have the Netflix dilemma of multilateral diplomacy, right? Last word to you, Ambassador King.
Yeah. Thank you very much. What I would say, my colleagues have touched on many of the what you asked. However, I take a slightly different view from our co-chairs. I think that I go back to I'm reinterpreting how they see the last reform, and even as the former USG sees it. The last time, only one, not two, one voted yes, Taiwan, and they're no longer in the council. And the other four, two abstained and two voted no. But what was instructive to me is that those that voted, the one that Russia, well, then the USSR, that voted no was the first to ratify. So it means that they can be convinced. So what we need is to continue to listen to the room for the right time to put a text on the table to start negotiating. The problem is that's where the veto exists, in trying to get an actual text. The only process in the United Nations today that operates without a text, where we just are locked in cycles of discussion. So we do have one example. It didn't look like this. Someone put a text on the table. So at some point, a group of countries are going to have to, all due respect to our co-chairs, put a text on the table to start those discussions. However, that time hasn't yet crystallized as to when that can happen. Widest possible political acceptance. Many member states have equated that to unanimity, but that's not what it is. It is the threshold based on the charter is 2/3 majority. So we have a number for that. Widest possible is if we can go further than that. So at some point, some bold countries are going to have to put on the table a text so that we can begin the give and take. So that's in the last IGN when L69 presented its model, 3 of the P5, the US, the UK, and France, all supported expansion in both categories. So they are on record support. Am I correct? On record saying that. China, not so much, because, and we all understand the geopolitics there. But at some point, some of us are going to have to just put a text, all due respect to our co-chairs, and get started with a give and take. So,
with that, please join me in thanking the panel. And I believe we are on to lunch after this. So.